welcome to this explainer. Today, we are unpacking a truly fascinating historical mystery. We're going back roughly 2 millennia to look at the earliest days of the Christian faith, and we're asking a question that sounds incredibly simple, but actually has a surprisingly complex answer. Were early Christians actually allowed to sing melodic music?
Now, you might be wondering why this was even a question in the first place, right? Well, to understand that, we have to look at the immense tension the early church was dealing with. On one hand, these communities desperately needed a way to unify their communal worship. They needed a shared voice. But on the exact opposite hand, they possessed this deep, almost existential fear of secular entertainment. They were highly suspicious of absolutely anything that looked, sounded, or even felt like the pagan culture surrounding them.
Okay, let's dive into this. Pagan Roman spectacles of the time were, well, they were intense. We're talking loud instrumental music, extreme theatricality, and just total sensory overload. Music was used in public cults for processions, games, even orgies. It was completely designed for emotional release and sheer spectacle. And honestly, early Christian leaders were terrified of this. They wanted worship that was the exact opposite. They wanted it completely a cappella, entirely focused on sacred texts, and defined by very strict solemnity. Basically, they wanted to elevate the soul, not arouse earthly passions. So they strictly rejected all those elaborate instrumental performances of the Greeks and Romans.
So how did they actually solve this? Did they just ban music altogether? Well, the surprising answer is no. Melodic music was allowed, but only through an extremely strict, instrument-free compromise. It was the single-line a cappella vocal style known as monophonic chanting, and this became their ultimate loophole. It was basically a way to sing without really singing in the secular sense.
Section 1. Adapting Ancient Roots, the Synagogue Loophole.
You see, the early Christians didn't just invent this loophole out of thin air. Instead, they looked backward to their Jewish heritage. They boldly stripped away the Levite musicians and all the physical instruments used in the great Jewish temple in Jerusalem. But they took the concept of temple sacrifices and adapted them into Eucharistic communion chants. And more importantly, they kept the vocal traditions of the Jewish synagogue, specifically the solemn recitation of Scripture and those public prayer formulas.
And that brings us to a really vital term, cantillation. This is essentially the ritual chanting of readings from the Hebrew Bible using specific melodic formulas. And these formulas were absolutely brilliant because they served a dual purpose. First off, the slight melodic rise and fall made the spoken words project way further, which kept the Scripture highly intelligible to a big crowd. Second, it added this layer of profound reverence. It created this peculiar, kind of beautiful mixture of speaking and singing that solemnized the text without ever slipping into the domain of secular foot-tapping entertainment.
Section 2. The Practical Twist, an ancient memory hack.
10 to 20%, that is the estimated ancient literacy rate, even among urban populations during this era. I really want you to let that sink in for a second. Almost no one in the early church could actually read. So think about it. How on earth do you teach complex doctrines, long prayers, and massive sections of Scripture to an entire population of completely illiterate worshipers?
Well, here's the answer. Chanting wasn't just art. It was literally a vital piece of ancient technology. It functioned exactly like a memory hack. The rhythm and the melody vastly enhanced the recall of long passages. It's kind of like how we can effortlessly remember the lyrics to a song we haven't heard in 20 years, but we totally forget a paragraph we read yesterday, right? The monophonic style ensured complete uniformity. The oral teaching made mass transmission possible. And by strictly controlling the repertoire, church leaders ensured doctrinal clarity. Honestly, chanting was literally the only viable method for ensuring orthodoxy when private reading was practically non-existent.
Section 3. The Rule Makers. Monks, synods, and spiritual warfare.
Now, much of this strict enforcement actually started out in the deserts with the earliest monks. The desert fathers of Egypt and the Middle East placed massive emphasis on the constant chanting of the Psalms. For them, this wasn't just practical, it was literal spiritual warfare. By constantly chanting in this repetitive rhythmic loop, they fostered unceasing prayer, they built group cohesion, and they promoted humility by singing in a simple unison that totally discouraged individual pride. But most importantly, it armed their minds against worldly distractions and temptations. It was quite literally a shield made of sound.
But, not everyone found this easy. St. Augustine, in his famous Confessions, actually captured this internal conflict perfectly. He recognized that music was incredibly useful to direct the heart to God and to help people remember their faith, but he was deeply human.
And he actually terrified himself by sometimes paying way more attention to the beautiful, soaring melodies than to the holy words that were actually being sung. For him, if music became about sensual delight and mere entertainment, it became a highly dangerous distraction from the divine.
So, to stop people from getting distracted by beautiful but potentially heretical melodies, institutional authorities had to step in. Back in the 4th century, the Council of Laodicea laid down some very strict rules. Step 1. Only designated canonical singers could sing in church, which established strict order. Step 2. Unapproved and apocryphal psalms were totally banned, no exceptions. Step 3. Absolute uniformity was mandated to prevent any kind of local innovation. Basically, they regulated melodic music incredibly tightly just to protect the orthodoxy of the faith.
Section 4. The Legacy. Inventing musical notation.
But here's where things take a crazy turn. As the church grew, they ran headfirst into a massive logistical wall. I mean, how do you transmit a gigantic oral tradition of specific chants perfectly across a rapidly expanding, wildly diverse global empire? Keeping this massive oral repertoire perfectly memorized and completely uniform by word of mouth alone, well, it became physically impossible.
And this logistical nightmare brilliantly illustrates that old saying, necessity really is the mother of invention. We started with pure oral tradition, sure, but by the 9th century, totally desperate to preserve these exact melodies across vast distances, the church invented early visual cues called neumes. And eventually, this evolved into Guido de Arezzo's 4-line staff. So think about that. The desperate need to perfectly preserve religious chant literally forced the invention of the modern musical notation system, the exact same system that every musician in the world uses today.
Just to clarify, these neumes were just simple early notation signs written right above the text to indicate the rise and fall of the melody. They were just really basic visual cues for the cantors. But over centuries, these simple little squiggles became more and more precise, ultimately allowing for the full, undeniable reproducibility of pitch.
So the crucial point here is that chanting in the early church was never, ever just about making things sound pretty. Not at all. It was a finely tuned, multifaceted strategy serving 5 enduring functions: liturgical structure, mnemonic memorization, spiritual contemplation, communal bonding, and doctrinal unity. This one singular practice somehow managed to unify totally disparate cultures, languages, and peoples into one cohesive, unified body for centuries.
Which leaves us with a final kind of provocative thought. Today, we are entirely dependent on written text and digital screens. We don't really have to memorize much of anything anymore, do we? But in gaining all this incredible convenience, could our modern reliance on screens actually be weakening the very communal memory, that shared voice, and the deep unity that this ancient oral memory hack originally built? It's definitely something to think about the next time you find yourself singing perfectly along to a song you haven't heard in 20 years. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the history behind the things we take for granted every single day.